In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one man who stands behind the firing line, not to fight beside the soldiers, not to lead them to glory, but to make sure they die facing forward. A bolt pistol, loaded with the Emperor's mercy. Feared more than the enemy. Hated more than the xenos. And without him, every regiment in the Imperium would crumble before breakfast. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Tonight we walk an entire lifetime in the boots of an Imperial Commissar, from the cold dormitories of the Schola Progenium to the killing fields of a dozen dying worlds. One man, one bolt pistol, nearly 6 decades of enforcing the Emperor's will on soldiers who'd rather shoot him than the enemy. It's not a story about glory. It's about what it costs to be the most hated man in every room. And what happens when you stop caring entirely. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They say a good commissar dies with his men. I have been a commissar for 57 standard years, and I am still breathing. Draw your own conclusions about my quality. My name is Dorvian Maesk. Lord Commissar, retired from active field duties by order of the Officio Prefectus, though I use the word retired loosely, as the Imperium of man does not truly understand the concept. I have served with 9 regiments across 14 campaign theaters. I have overseen the discipline of approximately 80,000 soldiers, give or take whatever number the Departamento Munitorum decided to fabricate on any given Tuesday. I have personally executed 347 men and women in the Emperor's name. I remember every single one. Not because I am sentimental, because a commissar who forgets faces starts making new ones. That is the kind of lesson they do not teach you in the Schola. You learn it the first time you shoot a man whose only crime was being too scared to stand up. And you realize that the sound his body makes hitting the mud is the same sound as every body before him and every body after. But I am getting ahead of myself. You want the full account, the whole wretched, glorious, blood-soaked length of it. Fine. I have time. The medici tells me I have perhaps 3 months before the tumors finish what a lifetime of enemy fire could not. I told her I would take 4, just to be contrary. She did not laugh. Medici staff never laugh. I think they remove the humor gland during their training. The Mechanicus probably bottles it and sells it to rogue traders. Let me start where it actually started. Not with the first shot, not with the first execution, with the place that made me into the thing I became. The Schola Progenium on Greymont was not the worst one in the segmentum, but it tried hard. Greymont itself was a hive world, the kind of place where the sky was the color of old bruises and the rain tasted like machine runoff. The Schola sat in the upper levels of Hive Decivar, which meant we were above the worst of the pollution, but below the spires where actual human beings lived. A perfect metaphor for our place in the Imperial hierarchy, really. Too good for the gutter, not good enough for comfort. Get used to that feeling, because it defines the commissariat. I arrived at the Schola at the age of 6. My father had been a captain in the Greymont 12th Provisional, killed during a routine suppression action on some backwater moon I never learned the name of. My mother had been an administrative clerk attached to the same regiment, dead from a fever she caught in the field hospital 3 months after him. I do not remember either of them clearly. I have a vague impression of a woman's voice singing something off-key and a man's hands that smelled like weapon oil. That is it. That is the sum total of my inheritance. 2 ghosts and a place in an Imperial orphanage where the drill abbots would spend the next 12 years beating me into something useful. The Schola's purpose was straightforward. take the orphaned children of Imperial servants and turn them into weapons. Not the crude kind, the sophisticated kind. The ecclesiarchy wanted priests. The administratum wanted bureaucrats. The adepta sororitas wanted warriors of faith. And the commissariat wanted something else entirely. They wanted children who could look another child in the eye and pull a trigger without flinching. That was the selection criterion. Everything else, the academics, the combat training, the theological instruction, that was all foundation work. The real test was whether you could kill someone you knew and still eat dinner afterward. I was not a remarkable student. I need to be clear about that because the official records of Lord Commissar Dorvian Maesk will tell you I graduated with distinction and high marks in tactical theory. The official records are, like most Imperial documents, a work of creative fiction. The truth is that I was middling in academics and poor in theological discourse because I had a habit of asking questions the drill abbots found inconvenient. I was above average in combat training for one reason only. I was small, fast, and had learned very early that the best way to win a fight against a bigger opponent was to not be where they expected you to be. Drill Abbot Crethan Hale, the old stone-faced bastard who ran our commissarial track, once told me I had the tactical instincts of a sewer rat and the theological conviction of a hungover priest. I think it was the closest he ever came to giving a compliment. Haley was a retired commissar himself, which meant he was one of the rare specimens who had survived long enough to age out of field service. He was missing his left arm below the elbow, had a face like a topographical map of a war zone, and spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being fed through a meat processor. He terrified us, not because he was cruel, though he was, but because he was competent. Cruel and stupid, you can predict. Cruel and competent means you never know when the blow is coming or why, only that it will arrive precisely when it will teach you the most. Haley understood something fundamental about the commissariat that most people miss. A commissar is not a killer. A killer is cheap. You can find killers in any underhive, any penal legion, any feral world with a sharp enough rock. A commissar is a performance. You are selling a story. The story is that you are the Emperor's will given human form. And if a man disobeys, he is not just breaking orders, he is defying the divine right of the God Emperor himself. Haley taught us that the bolt pistol was the least important tool in our arsenal. The most important was the voice. The way you stood, the way your coat moved, the way you looked at a man before you killed him, so that every other man watching understood, on a level deeper than thought, that this was not murder. This was sacrament. There were 68 of us in the commissarial track when I arrived. By the time I was 12, there were 31. The others had been washed out, redirected to the Tempestus Sions, or the Administratum, or simply disappeared in the way that underperforming students in Imperial institutions tend to disappear. We did not ask where they went. Asking questions about disappeared classmates was itself a test, and we learned quickly that the correct answer was silence. Among the 31 who remained, I had what you might generously call friends. There was Palev Gren, a tall, quiet boy from a naval officer's family who was better at academics than anyone else in our year, but froze during live-fire exercises. There was Marit Eske, a girl with short-cropped red hair and a mean right hook from the sororitas track, who somehow ended up in our combat training rotations after she broke a drill abbot's nose, and the ecclesiarchy decided her aggression was a virtue rather than a defect. And there was Fennec Rowe, who was the best shot in our year and the worst human being, a bully with cold eyes who hurt smaller students not because he enjoyed it, which would have at least been honest, but because he thought it demonstrated leadership qualities. Haley never corrected him. I understood why later. The execution test came when I was 16. I know the official doctrine claims it is not a universal practice. I know some scholai have abandoned it or substituted other evaluations. I know this because I have read the sanitized reports the Commissariat publishes for external consumption, and they are worth exactly as much as the recycled pulp they are printed on. On Greymont, the test was real, and it was exactly what you think it was. They pulled Palav Gren out of morning assembly. He had been flagged for removal from the commissarial track 3 months earlier due to his continued difficulties in combat situations. He was not a coward. I want to be precise about that. Palev was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of killing. There is a difference, and it matters, though not to the Schola Progenium. To them, the result was the same. A commissar who hesitates before pulling the trigger is a dead commissar, and worse, a commissar whose hesitation gets others killed. Palev had been given multiple chances to overcome his reluctance. He had not. By the Schola's standards, he had failed, and failure in the commissarial track had specific terminal consequences. They brought him to the training chapel. A bare room with a stone floor, an aquila on the wall, and nothing else. No windows, no decorations, just cold rock and the Emperor's gaze. They lined up our cohort, 17 of us by then, and Hale explained what was about to happen with the same flat, instructional tone he used when explaining las weapon maintenance. One of us would be selected to execute Palev. The selection would be based on proximity. Palev had been closest to 4 of us during our years in the Schola. Those 4 were me, Marit, Fennec, and a boy named Aldous Grent, who had the misfortune of sharing a dormitory bunk with Palev for 3 years. Fennec volunteered before Hale finished speaking. He stepped forward with that cold little smile of his and reached for his training pistol, and I watched Hale's eyes and saw something I had never seen before. Disappointment, not in Fennec's willingness to kill, in his eagerness. Hale looked at Fennec the way a craftsman looks at a flawed tool, functional but wrong. He told Fennec to step back. Then he looked at me. I am not going to describe what happened next in detail. Not because it haunts me, though it does, but because there is nothing instructive in the mechanics. Palev looked at me. I looked at him. He said something that I have spent 45 years trying to forget and have never quite managed. I raised the pistol. I fired. He fell. The sound was very loud in that stone room, and then it was very quiet. And that was the end of Palev Gren, who had wanted to be a scholar of Imperial history, and who once made me laugh so hard during evening mess that I sprayed recaf through my nose. The Schola took his body away within the hour. I do not know what they did with it. I never asked. That was the test, you see. Not whether I could pull the trigger. Whether I could pull the trigger and then go back to my life without breaking. I ate dinner that night. I slept that night. I woke up the next morning and attended tactical theory, and some small, essential thing inside me was different, and it would never be the same again, and that was the point. This is what the Commissariat does. It takes human beings and removes just enough of their humanity to make them functional. Not all of it, because a commissar with no humanity is just a psychopath with a hat. And those are worse than useless in the field. Too much, and they become like Fennec. I learned what happened to him during my 2nd year with the 141st. He had been assigned to the 9th Colossian Fusiliers, a penal-adjacent regiment on the eastern fringe, and had executed 14 soldiers in his first 3 months for infractions that included improper bootlacing, insufficient enthusiasm during morning prayer, and failure to salute with adequate speed. His regiment fragged him during a night patrol, shot in the back of the head with a Luss round. No witnesses, no investigation. The commissariat filed it as killed in action and moved on. I remember reading the notification and looking down at my bolt pistol, the same one they had given me in the High Chapel, and thinking that the distance between Fennec and me was not as wide as I wanted to believe. We had both stood in that stone room and pulled the trigger. The difference was that Fennec had enjoyed it and I had not, and that difference had kept me alive and put him in the ground. You need to keep just enough humanity to understand the men you are meant to inspire, and just little enough to kill them when you must. It is a narrow edge. Most of us fall off one side or the other eventually. The trick is lasting long enough for it to matter. I graduated from the Schola Progenium at 18. They gave me a bolt pistol, a chainsword, a greatcoat with red-lined collar and cuffs, and an officer's peaked cap with the Imperial Aquila. I stood in the High Chapel of the Schola and swore oaths that sounded ancient and important and that I have since forgotten the specific wording of, which probably says something about the value of oaths. Haley was there. He shook my hand, which was the first and only time he ever touched me without the intention of inflicting pain. He told me two things. The first was that I was being assigned to the 141st Kethrian Rifles as a cadet commissar, and that I should prepare for deployment within the week. The second was a piece of advice that I carry with me to this day. He said, "When you arrive at your regiment, the first thing every soldier will do is try to figure out what kind of commissar you are, the cruel kind or the fair kind, the by-the-book kind or the flexible kind, the kind who shoots first or the kind who warns first." He said, "Do not let them figure it out. The moment they think they know you, they stop being afraid of you, and a commissar who is not feared is a corpse in a fancy coat." I thanked him. I never saw him again. I heard later that he died in his quarters of a heart seizure, alone, which is how most retired commissars die. Alone, and usually in a room with very few personal possessions, because the commissariat does not encourage you to accumulate things you might miss. The 141st Kethrian Rifles were a medium-tier line infantry regiment from Cathris Majoris, an industrial world in the Segmentum Obscurus that produced soldiers the way it produced everything else, in bulk, without frills, and with a vague hope that most of them would function as intended. They had been raised 3 decades before my assignment, had served in 4 campaign theaters, and had a service record the Departamento Munitorum would classify as adequate, which in practical terms meant they had not distinguished themselves enough to earn commendations, and had not failed badly enough to be disbanded. They were, in short, exactly what the commissariat assigns to newly graduated cadets. Nothing too dangerous, nothing too prestigious. A testing ground, a place to make your early mistakes where the consequences would be manageable. Their commanding officer was Colonel Varestren, and I hated him within 14 seconds of our first meeting. Stren was everything wrong with the Imperial Guard's officer class distilled into a single, portly, sweating man with a waxed mustache and a family name that had purchased his commission 3 generations earlier. He had been transferred to the 141st from a garrison posting on his family's homeworld just 4 months before the Carhold deployment, which at the time I attributed to routine reshuffling. Though looking back, the timing was remarkably convenient for people who needed a commanding officer, unlikely to question his orders. He had never led a charge. He had never fired his sidearm outside of ceremonial occasions. He ran his regiment from a command post that was always suspiciously far from the front line, and made tactical decisions based on whatever his adjutants told him, which meant his tactical decisions were actually his adjutant's tactical decisions, filtered through a man who understood military strategy the way a Grox understands astrophysics. The soldiers of the 141st endured him because soldiers endure everything. That is what soldiers do. They endure bad food, bad officers, bad weather, and bad luck with the same grim resignation. Because the alternative is to complain, and complaining in the Imperial Guard is a luxury reserved for officers and the dead. I arrived on Carhold 4, a dust-colored agri-world on the rimward edge of the sector, where the 141st had been deployed as part of a garrison force following reports of increased Orc activity in the surrounding subsector. Carhold 4 was the kind of world that made you understand why the Imperium had a recruitment problem. The planet's surface was dominated by vast automated harvesting complexes, industrial-scale farming operations that processed native grain crops using machinery older than most civilizations. The workers who operated these complexes were technically free citizens, but the distinction between a free citizen on Carhold 4 and a servitor was largely academic. They worked 16-hour shifts, lived in prefabricated housing blocks that were bolted directly to the harvesting platforms, and died in industrial accidents at a rate that would have concerned the Administratum if the Administratum had ever bothered to count them, which it had not. The air tasted like machine exhaust and processed fertilizer. The sky was yellow-gray with the haze from the processing plants. It was, in short, a perfectly standard Imperial world. I felt right at home. The Orc problem, when it arrived the way Orc problems always do. Suddenly, violently, and with a complete disregard for whatever defensive plans the garrison had spent months preparing. A moderate-sized Orc warband, perhaps 12,000 greenskins with attendant vehicles and crewed aircraft, hit the northern harvesting district 6 weeks after my arrival. They came out of the wastes where the long-range Auspex coverage was patchy, which either spoke to cunning planning on the part of their war boss, or, more likely, was just Orc luck, the random fortune they seemed to generate through sheer force of aggressive stupidity. Colonel Stren responded to the invasion with precisely the decisive leadership you would expect from a man whose military experience consisted primarily of reading about other people's battles. He panicked, not openly because even Stren had enough political instinct to know that visible panic from a commanding officer was bad form. But I could see it. I had been trained to see it. The slight tremor in his hands when he held the tactical map. The way his eyes moved too fast, scanning for information he did not have the training to interpret. The way he deferred every decision to his adjutant, Captain Wellner Breck, a competent but exhausted man who was effectively running the regiment while Stren took credit for his work. There is something about the dynamic between a commissar and a commanding officer that matters for what comes later. A commissar does not command. A commissar advises, observes, and enforces. The authority to execute gives us effective veto power over any decision we deem heretical or dangerously incompetent. But actually exercising that authority against a senior officer is a career-ending move at best and a death sentence at worst. If you shoot a colonel, you had better be absolutely certain that every surviving officer in the regiment agrees he deserved it. Because if they do not, you will find yourself on the wrong end of a fragging incident within the week. The commissariat teaches you to be the most powerful person in the room. Reality teaches you that power is useless if you cannot survive using it. Stren was incompetent. Everyone knew he was incompetent, but he was connected, and connected officers have allies in the Departamento Munitorum, and a cadet commissar who executes a connected colonel on his first deployment does not get promoted. He gets reassigned to a penal legion if he is lucky. So I watched Stren dither. While the Orcs overran 3 harvesting complexes, I watched him deploy reserves to the wrong sector because he misread the tactical map. I watched him order a counterattack that left a company exposed on an open flank because he did not understand that the terrain map's contour lines represented elevation changes. And I watched 63 soldiers die in the first week of fighting because of decisions that a competent platoon leader would not have made, let alone a regimental colonel. I filed reports. I documented everything. I sent my assessments through the proper channels to the commissariat's sector office, where they were no doubt received, read, and filed in whatever archive the bureaucracy uses to store inconvenient truths. Nothing happened. Nothing was going to happen. Stren's family had connections in the administratum, and the 141st's casualties were within acceptable parameters by Departamento Munitorum standards, which tells you everything you need to know about the Departamento Munitorum's standards. Breck requested reinforcements 3 times during the first month. 3 times the requests were acknowledged, and no reinforcements arrived. After the 3rd denial, I found him in his quarters at 2 in the morning, staring at the deployment order that had sent us to Carhold. He looked up at me and said something that I dismissed at the time as the frustration of an overworked officer. He said, "Commissar, have you noticed that our original intelligence briefing estimated the Orc presence at 2 to 4,000? We have already confirmed kills exceeding that number, and they are still coming. Either our intelligence was wrong, or someone knew it was wrong and sent us anyway." I told him that intelligence estimates were always imprecise, and that the Departamento Munitorum did not deliberately waste military assets. He gave me a look that I did not understand until decades later. It was the look of a man who already knew the answer to his own question, and was disappointed that I did not. My first execution happened during the 3rd week of the Carhold campaign. A trooper named Revik Sul, a young man who had been with the regiment for less than a year, broke and ran during an Orc assault on the southern perimeter. I do not blame him. The Orcs that hit our position were the big ones, knobs in crude power armor with choppers the size of a grown man, and they came through our firing line like it was made of wet paper. Half the platoon broke. Sul was just the one I caught. He ran past me, eyes wide, las rifle thrown aside, and I knew in that instant that I had approximately 2 seconds to make a decision that would define my relationship with this regiment for as long as I was attached to it. If I let him go, every soldier watching would know that Commissar Maesk did not enforce discipline under fire. I would be finished. Not dead, maybe, but irrelevant, which is worse. If I shot him, every soldier watching would know that Commissar Maesk enforced the Emperor's law without exception. They would hate me, they would fear me, and they would hold the line. I shot him. He fell face forward into the dirt, and the back of his head was gone, and 2 soldiers near me who had been edging backward suddenly found their courage again and started firing. The line held. We repelled the assault. Later that night, I sat in my quarters and drank half a bottle of Amisek I had stolen from Stren's personal supply, and I thought about Palev Gren, and about how the second time was not easier than the first. Everyone tells you it gets easier. It does not. You just get better at pretending it does. The Carhold campaign lasted 4 months. We broke the Orc war band eventually, not through any brilliance on Stren's part, but through the simple mathematics of attrition. We had supplies. They did not. We had reinforcements from the planetary defense forces. They did not. We had fortified positions and heavy weapons. They had enthusiasm and sharp objects. In the end, the numbers told. The war broke apart into smaller raiding parties that were hunted down over the following weeks, and Carhold IV was declared secure, and Colonel Stren was given a commendation for his handling of the campaign, because the Imperium rewards survival and punishes failure, and since Stren had not technically failed, he was rewarded. Breck, who had actually won the campaign through competent management of resources and defensive positioning, received nothing. I received my promotion from cadet to full commissar, which was the only outcome of the Carhold campaign that I considered just, and even that was mostly because the commissariat needed warm bodies and I had not died. Breck was transferred to the 88th Volpavian Dragoons the following year. I heard through the informal channels that officers use when they want information the Departamento Munitorum does not officially distribute that he had requested the transfer himself. The Volpavians were a frontline assault regiment, a unit that measured its operational life in months rather than years. It was, for a staff officer of Breck's talent, an unusual choice. He was killed on the Sandral Prime during a breach assault 4 months after his transfer. I did not think much of it at the time. People die in the Guard. It is what we do. It was only decades later, sitting at a desk on Bakin Tertius with a classified file open in front of me, that I understood. I wondered whether Breck had found something in those deployment records, whether he had seen what I had not, and whether the transfer to a suicide unit had been his own choice or someone else's solution to a man who asked inconvenient questions. But Carhold taught me the one thing the Schola could not: what a commissar actually does. We stand at the back of the line and make sure the line does not move. Everything else is theater. Once you understand that, you can start to survive it. I served with the 141st for another 2 years after Carhold. 2 years of garrison duty, minor skirmishes, and watching Stren continue to be promoted despite a talent for command that could charitably be described as non-existent. I filed my reports. I maintained discipline. I executed when necessary and warned when possible, and I developed a reputation among the rank and file as a commissar who would give you one chance before reaching for his bolt pistol. 1, not 2, not 0. 1. It was a system that worked because soldiers appreciate consistency, even the murderous kind. They do not need you to be kind. They need you to be predictable. A commissar who might shoot you or might not is more terrifying than one who always shoots, because fear of the unknown is the deepest fear there is. But a commissar who is utterly random in his punishments breeds not fear, but resentment. And resentment is the first step toward a fragging incident. I also developed the habit of talking. Not the inspirational speeches the commissariat trains you to deliver. All thunder and righteous fury and invocations of the Emperor's undying light. Those have their place, but I found that the soldiers I was meant to oversee responded better to something more direct, something that acknowledged, without ever explicitly stating, that we were all trapped in the same meat grinder and that the difference between us was merely that I wore a nicer hat. I would walk the trenches before an engagement and say things like, "The good news is the enemy is out there and we are in here, and the bad news is the same." Or, "I understand the food tastes terrible, but I assure you the alternative to eating is considerably worse, because I have seen it, and it involves the orcs." The soldiers would laugh, or at least produce the grim exhalation that passes for laughter in the Guard, and something in the air would shift. Not much. Enough. Haley had told me that a commissar is a performance. I had found my role. Not the terrifying executioner, not the beloved leader, something in between. The man who acknowledged the horror and kept walking anyway, and who expected you to do the same. The Departamento Munitorum transferred me in my 4th year of service. The paperwork cited routine reassignment, which was bureaucratic language for the commissariat. Noticed you are getting too comfortable, and comfort breeds complacency. They sent me to the 77th Dracian Line Infantry, a regiment that would become, for better and for worse, the central fixture of my career for the next 2 decades. The 77th Dracian were different from the 141st in almost every meaningful way. Where the Kethrians had been adequate, the Dracians were sharp. Dracia itself was a fortress world in the Segmentum Pacificus, a planet that had been invaded so many times over its history that its entire culture had evolved around the expectation of war. Dracian children learned to field strip a las rifle before they learned to write. Dracian women served alongside men in the regiment, which was unusual but not unheard of in the Guard, and the Dracians considered any suggestion that this was remarkable to be profoundly insulting. They were hard people from a hard world, and they did not need a commissar to make them fight. They needed a commissar because the Departamento Munitorum required one, and because even the best regiments occasionally produce individuals who need killing. Colonel Brennick Torval commanded the 77th, and he was everything Varus Stren was not. A career soldier who had risen through the ranks rather than purchased his position, Torval was the kind of officer that the Imperial Guard produces once in a generation, and then spends the rest of the time trying to figure out how to replicate. He was tall, lean, gray-haired even then, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone they used to build Dracian fortifications. He spoke quietly, which, in a military environment where everyone else shouted, was somehow more commanding than any volume. He knew the name of every soldier in his regiment, not because he made a conscious effort to memorize them, but because he actually cared, which was so rare among Guard officers that it bordered on the suspicious. And he was brilliant. Not the kind of brilliance that announces itself with grand strategies and sweeping proclamations. The quiet kind. The kind that notices a slight change in enemy patrol patterns 3 days before the attack and repositions the regiment's reserves accordingly. The kind that reads a terrain map once and sees things that other officers miss after studying it for hours. I distrusted him immediately. The Schola teaches you to distrust competence, because competence in the wrong hands is more dangerous than incompetence in any hands. A stupid officer gets his men killed through error. A smart officer who turns can get an entire sector killed through design. But weeks became months, and months became campaigns, and Torval continued to be exactly what he appeared to be. A good officer who cared about his soldiers and won his battles through skill rather than luck or sacrifice. I began to relax. That was my mistake, though it would take years for the consequences to arrive. The 77th's first major engagement after my assignment was on Ithena, a civilized world in the Pacificus that had the misfortune of attracting the attention of Drukhari raiders. For anyone fortunate enough to have never encountered the Dark Eldar, the orcs are brutal but predictable. Chaos is terrifying but comprehensible in the sense that you can understand, even if you do not wish to, what drives a man to damnation. The Tyranids are a force of nature, as impersonal and unstoppable as gravity. The Drukhari are none of these things. The Drukhari are cruelty, given purpose and intelligence and a sense of aesthetics that makes their cruelty infinitely worse, because they do not just hurt you. They make it beautiful. They turn suffering into art, and they are very, very good artists. The raids on Ithena had been escalating for 3 years before the 77th was deployed. The Drukhari would emerge from webway portals in the rural districts, hit settlements with surgical precision, take captives, and vanish before any military response could arrive. The planetary defense forces were useless against them, partly because the PDF's equipment was antiquated, and partly because fighting Drukhari is like fighting smoke. By the time we arrived, 17 major settlements had been raided, approximately 40,000 civilians had been taken, and the planet's population was on the edge of mass panic. Our mandate was simple: stop the raids, protect the remaining population centers, kill anything with pointed ears and a bad attitude. The mandate did not include a plan for how to accomplish any of this, because the Departamento Munitorum's idea of tactical planning was to deploy soldiers in the general vicinity of the problem and hope for the best. Torval was the one who figured out the pattern, and in hindsight, I should have paid closer attention to how quickly he figured it out. The planetary intelligence staff had been analyzing Drukhari raid data for 3 years and had found nothing. Torval looked at the same data for 2 days and saw the entire structure. The raids were not random. They targeted specific settlements, always in the same sequence, always at intervals that corresponded to local harvest cycles, when the maximum number of civilians would be concentrated in processing centers. The Drukhari were not raiding indiscriminately. They were farming. Ithena was a livestock pen, and its people were the livestock, and the Drukhari returned each season to collect their yield. Once Torval understood this, he could predict where the next raid would hit. I remember feeling a momentary unease at how cleanly the pattern had appeared to him, as though it had been waiting to be seen, and he was the only one with eyes sharp enough to find it. I attributed that unease to professional paranoia and moved on. That was Torval. He made brilliance look natural, and I was not yet experienced enough to know that natural brilliance and something else entirely can look exactly the same from the outside. He redeployed the regiment, concentrating forces around the 3 most likely target settlements, fortified positions using the settlement's existing infrastructure, and set ambushes along the most probable approach vectors from the known webway portal locations. The Drukhari came on the 9th night. They came in the way they always came, fast and silent, with raiding craft that moved through the air like black needles and warriors who seemed to materialize from shadows. But this time the shadows shot back. Torval had positioned heavy weapon teams in concealed bunkers along the settlement's perimeter, with overlapping fields of fire that turned the approach lanes into kill zones. The Drukhari hit the outer perimeter and ran into a wall of las fire and heavy bolter rounds that shredded their forward elements before they even understood they were walking into a trap. The fighting lasted 6 hours. It was vicious, close quarters, and ugly in the way that fighting xenos in residential areas always is, with las bolts punching through hab-block walls and soldiers dying in rooms where civilian families had been eating dinner hours earlier. The Drukhari were superb individual fighters, faster and more skilled than any human soldier, but they had come expecting sheep and found wolves, and the shock of organized resistance disrupted their coordination in ways that their arrogant confidence could not compensate for. We killed approximately 800 of them that night. We lost 214 of our own. We rescued 31 civilian captives from a Drukhari transport vessel that Torval's sappers managed to disable with melta charges before it could lift off. The captives were in bad shape. Some of them were in a condition that I am not going to describe, because there are things that do not need to be put into words and that I do not wish to relive. And the things the Drukhari do to their prisoners are at the top of that list. I will say only that the regiment's medici staff worked through the night and the following day, and that not all the captives survived their rescue, and that some of the ones who did survive would probably have preferred not to. We found the webway portal the Drukhari had been using in a cave system beneath a mountain ridge 12 kilometers from the settlement. Torval brought down the mountain on top of it with demolition charges, burying the portal under 1,000 tons of rock. The Drukhari raids on Ithena stopped. Whether they simply found another hunting ground, or whether the destruction of the portal actually disrupted their access to the region, I do not know. The result was the same. Athena was saved, and the 77th Dracian were heroes. I killed 3 men during the Athena campaign, not Drukhari, my own soldiers. 2 of them were standard disciplinary executions, men who broke and ran during the fighting and could not be recalled. The 3rd was different. A corporal named Gavin Tull, a 12-year veteran who had served with the 77th since its founding, was caught looting the Drukhari transport vessel during the cleanup. Not for valuables, for Drukhari weapons. Specifically, a splinter pistol and several vials of some substance that the regiment's medici identified as a Drukhari combat stimulant. Tull claimed he was collecting intelligence material for the Ordo Xenos. This was a lie. He was planning to sell the items to a contact in the local black market, which I knew because I had spent 2 weeks investigating a smuggling ring operating out of the regiment's supply depot, and Tull's name had appeared in the seized correspondence of a civilian fence we had arrested the previous month. I executed Tull in front of his company at morning assembly. Before I shot him, I explained in specific detail exactly what the substances he had been planning to sell would do to whoever used them. The Drukhari combat stimulant was a neural accelerant that boosted reflexes and pain tolerance to superhuman levels for approximately 90 seconds, after which the user's central nervous system collapsed and they died in a manner that even the most desensitized combat veteran would find distressing. Tull had known this. He had planned to sell it anyway. I shot him, and then I walked down the assembled ranks and asked, loudly enough for everyone to hear, if anyone else was feeling entrepreneurial. No one answered. The smuggling ring collapsed within the week. It was not the most satisfying moment of my career, but it was in the top 5. The years that followed Athena were what I think of as the good years. Though good is a relative term when your profession involves watching young people in industrial quantities. The 77th deployed to a succession of campaign theaters across the Pacificus, fighting the kinds of wars that the Imperium fights constantly and that never make it into the official histories. A border skirmish against orc freebooters on the mining world of Pellucid Tertius, a suppression action against a secessionist movement on Halvar's Landing, where the local governor had declared independence from the Imperium and had to be reminded with extreme prejudice that independence was not an option. A brief, brutal engagement with Kroot mercenaries in the employ of a Tau client state on the edge of the Eastern Fringe, where I discovered that Kroot are significantly harder to kill than they look, and that their table manners are exactly as bad as the intelligence briefing suggested. Through all of it, Torvald commanded and I enforced, and the 77th operated with a precision and efficiency that made us the envy of whatever battle group we were attached to. Torvald and I developed a working relationship that I would not call friendship, because commissars do not have friends, but that was closer to mutual respect than anything I had experienced before or have experienced since. He understood my role and did not resent it. I understood his competence and did not suspect it. We disagreed often, argued rarely, and when we did argue, it was about tactical matters where the disagreement was productive rather than personal. He never questioned my authority to execute, and I never questioned his authority to command, and between those two boundaries we found a working equilibrium that served the regiment well. There was one evening on Halvar's Landing, during the suppression campaign, when the fighting was done and the two of us were sharing a bottle of Amasek on the roof of a captured governmental palace, looking out over a city that was still burning in places. Torvald looked at my bolt pistol, which I had placed on the ledge beside me as I always did, within arm's reach, always, and he said something I have never forgotten. "Does it ever talk to you, Dorvian?" "The pistol?" I frowned. He leaned forward. In combat, do you ever feel like it knows before you do? Like the weight of it shifts and your hand moves, and the decision is already made before your mind catches up? I laughed and told him that was called training, not mysticism. He turned back to the burning city. Yes, I suppose it is. But sometimes training and something else feel very similar, do they not? I thought it was a strange thing to say. I filed it away as one of Torvald's occasional bouts of late-night philosophy, the kind that officers indulge in when the amasec is strong and the day has been long. I did not understand what he was really telling me until I stood in his command tent on Solemnos Reach with that same bolt pistol raised, and his gray eyes looking at it as though it were an old friend arriving on schedule. I was promoted to Senior Commissar in my 15th year of service, which meant I was now responsible for overseeing not just the 77th, but also any junior commissars assigned to the regiment. By that point, the 77th had cycled through 3 full generations of soldiers. The men and women I had first served with on Ythena were mostly dead or mustered out, replaced by fresh recruits from Dracia who had heard stories about the regiment's legendary commissar, the one who gave you one chance and told jokes while doing it. My reputation had become its own entity, larger than me, more useful than me, and considerably more intimidating. Soldiers who had never met me were already afraid of me when they arrived, which saved me the trouble of establishing dominance through demonstration. I appreciated the efficiency, if not the accuracy. The stories made me sound taller, meaner, and more dramatic than I actually was. One persistent rumor claimed I had once executed a man with a thrown chainsword from 30 meters. I have no idea where that came from. A thrown chainsword would not activate. The physics alone make it absurd. But the soldiers believed it, and belief is more powerful than truth in the Imperial Guard. So I never corrected it. Then came Solemnos Reach, and everything changed. Solemnos Reach was a shrine world, one of those places the ecclesiarchy builds on planets that have some historical connection to a saint or a miracle, or a particularly good day the Emperor once had 10,000 years ago. The planet's surface was dominated by cathedral complexes, pilgrim roads, reliquary vaults, and architecture designed to make you feel small and insignificant, which was the point. The permanent population was a mix of ecclesiarchy officials, ministerium clergy, and the vast underclass of bonded laborers who maintained the shrines and served the pilgrims. It was beautiful in the way Imperial architecture is always beautiful, designed to crush your individual will beneath the weight of something much larger and much older than you. Perfect place for a chaos incursion, and that is exactly what happened. The initial reports were confused, as initial reports about chaos always are. Warp storms in the subsector had been intensifying for months, disrupting astropathic communications and making warp travel unpredictable. Several pilgrim ships had disappeared en route to Solemnos. Then the ground-side reports started coming in. Cultist activity in the Undercroft districts beneath the major cathedrals, disappearances among the bonded labor population, strange markings appearing on walls, livestock born with too many eyes, the usual precursors that the Imperium always recognizes too late, because acknowledging the presence of chaos requires admitting that the Emperor's protection has limits, and admitting that the Emperor's protection has limits is itself borderline heretical, which creates a feedback loop of denial that the forces of the archenemy exploit with reliable consistency. By the time the 77th deployed to Solemnos, the situation had deteriorated from concerning to catastrophic. A full Chaos War Band had emerged from the Warp Rift that had opened in the northern polar region, led by a Chaos Lord whose name I am not going to speak, because I do not give the servants of the ruinous powers the dignity of remembrance. The warband was primarily Tsinch-affiliated, which meant sorcerers, mutation, and reality-bending madness that makes conventional military tactics approximately as useful as a paper umbrella in a plasma storm. Tsinchian forces do not fight the way other enemies fight. They manipulate, they deceive. They attack your certainty before they attack your body, because Tsinch feeds on change and confusion, and a battlefield full of soldiers who no longer trust their own senses is a battlefield already half lost. The 77th was attached to a battle group that included elements of 4 other guard regiments and a company of Adepta Sororitas from the Order of the Argent Shroud. There was also an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus named Varantius Cole, who arrived with a retinue of warrior acolytes and 2 sanctioned psychers, and the kind of authority that made even Lord Generals lower their voices. The battle group's strategic objective was to contain the Chaos incursion within the northern polar district, prevent it from spreading to the populated equatorial regions, and ultimately close the warp rift. The tactical reality was considerably less elegant. The Tsinchian forces had entrenched themselves in the cathedral complex of St. Caradine's Repose, a vast structure built into the base of a mountain that contained catacombs extending hundreds of meters underground. Assaulting the complex meant fighting through narrow corridors, collapsing tunnels, and spaces where the warp bled through the walls, and reality became unreliable. It was the worst possible environment for conventional infantry, and the 77th was as conventional as they came. Torval adapted. He always adapted. That was his gift. Where other commanders would have followed doctrine and pushed straight into the cathedral complex, Torval recognized that direct assault played into the Tsinchian strategy of luring Imperial forces into an environment where confusion and disorientation would do more damage than any weapon. Instead, he proposed a siege approach. Seal the exits, cut the supply lines, starve the warband out of the catacombs, and force them to fight on ground of our choosing. It was patient, methodical, and exactly what the Tsinchian forces did not expect, because patience is the antithesis of Tsinch's nature. Change requires action. Stasis is the enemy of change. By refusing to act, Torval was denying the enemy the dynamic battlefield they needed. It worked. For 6 weeks, it worked beautifully. The 77th established a cordon around St. Caradine's Repose, fortified every approach, and waited. The Chaos forces launched sorties that were repelled with heavy but manageable casualties. Inquisitor Cole's acolytes conducted surgical strikes into the upper catacombs that disrupted the warband's sorcerous operations. The Sororitas held the western perimeter with an immovable hymn-singing fanaticism that makes them simultaneously the best allies and the most exhausting dinner companions in the Imperial military. Slowly, methodically, the noose tightened. We were winning. I could feel it. The soldiers could feel it. Morale was higher than I had seen in any Chaos campaign, because Torval's strategy gave them something rare in the Imperial Guard, the sense that someone was in control. And then Torval started making decisions that were too good. I noticed it first during the 7th week, when a Chaos counterattack hit our eastern perimeter, in a pattern that Torval had somehow anticipated 12 hours in advance. He had repositioned the regiment's heavy weapons teams to cover the exact approach the enemy used, creating a kill zone that annihilated the assault force before it breached our lines. When I asked him how he had known, he said he had studied the enemy's previous sortie patterns and extrapolated. It was plausible. Torval was brilliant. I accepted the explanation. But something nagged at me. The pattern he described did not match my own observations. I had been studying the same sortie data, and I had not seen the pattern he claimed to have found. That could mean he was smarter than me, which was possible, or it could mean something else entirely. The second incident was less ambiguous. 2 days later, the war band attempted to break the cordon through a section of the perimeter that was temporarily weakened during a shift rotation. The timing should have been impossible to predict. Shift rotations were randomized specifically to prevent this kind of exploitation. But Torval had, hours before the attack, ordered additional reinforcements to that section. When the assault hit, our lines held. When I confronted him about it, he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not guilt. It was something worse. It was certainty. The kind of absolute, unshakable conviction that does not come from analysis or experience. It comes from knowledge that has no legitimate source. I want to be very clear about what happened next, because the official reports got it wrong, deliberately, and the story that circulated through the Guard afterward bears almost no resemblance to reality. The official version says that Colonel Brennick Torval was discovered to be a chaos cultist who had been corrupted prior to the Solemnos campaign and who was using his position to sabotage Imperial operations. This is a lie. Torval was not sabotaging anything. He was winning. That was the problem. I conducted my investigation quietly over the course of 10 days, using the authority of the Commissariat to access Torval's personal quarters, his communications logs, and his private effects. I want to be clear about why no one had caught this sooner, because it is the kind of thing that sounds impossible until you understand how Tzeentch works. The corruption was new, weeks old, perhaps less. It did not announce itself with mutation or madness, or the stink of the warp that a psyker could sense across a battlefield. It was a whisper, buried inside the mind of a man whose thoughts were already brilliant, and it wore his brilliance as camouflage. Inquisitor Cole's psychers were focused entirely on the Rift and the enemy sorcerers, not on screening the command staff of an allied regiment that was winning. And Torval himself gave them no reason to look. He functioned. He commanded. He was, by every external measure, exactly what he had always been. Only better, and better is not a symptom anyone screens for. What I found was worse than corruption, because corruption implies choice, and what I found suggested that the choice, if there ever was one, had been made so gradually that Torval himself might not have recognized the moment he crossed the line. In his quarters, I found writings, pages and pages of tactical analysis in Torval's precise handwriting, but interspersed with symbols and diagrams that no sane mind would produce. Not the crude blasphemies of a willing heretic, something more subtle, mathematical formulae that described troop movements with an accuracy that violated probability. Diagrams of enemy positions that included information our auspex could not possibly have detected. Predictions of enemy behavior that were not predictions at all, but descriptions of events that had not yet occurred, written in the past tense. Torval was receiving information from somewhere, and the somewhere was not any Imperial intelligence source. I spoke to him on the evening of the 10th day. I went to his command tent alone. Protocol demanded I bring a squad of armed soldiers, and preferably a sanctioned psyker, but Protocol had not accounted for this situation, and there was a clock running that Protocol knew nothing about. Inquisitor Cole was in the field with us. An Ordo Malleus Inquisitor does not tolerate the presence of chaos taint in a command structure. If Cole discovered what I had discovered, he would not quietly execute one corrupted colonel. He would declare the entire 77th Dracian compromised by association, and he would purge it. 2,000 soldiers, every officer, every medici, every cook, all of them given the Emperor's mercy and their bodies burned, because that is what the Ordo Malleus does when chaos touches a regiment, and there is any doubt about how far the rot has spread. I had perhaps days before Cole's psyker sensed what I had already found in Torvald's quarters. There is a difference in the eyes of the Ordo Malleus between a living, corrupted commander sitting at the head of a regiment and a corrupted commander already dead by a commissar's hand with the taint cut out at the root. The first is an active infection of unknown reach, and the response to an active infection is fire. The second is a wound already cauterized, evidence that the regiment's own discipline had found and killed the rot. If I acted first, if I removed the source cleanly and reported it as a standard commissarial execution for a lesser cause, the regiment might survive. If I brought soldiers or a psyker into that tent, word would reach the Inquisitor within the hour, and he would find a live problem instead of a solved one. And I would be signing the death warrant of every man and woman I was sworn to keep in line. So I went alone. Torvald was sitting at his desk, studying maps. He looked tired, not the tiredness of overwork, the tiredness of a man carrying something too heavy. He looked up when I entered, and I saw in his eyes that he already knew why I was there. He had probably known before I did. That was the nature of what had happened to him. I told him what I had found. He did not deny it. He did not try to justify it. He sat very still for a long time, and then he said something that I will carry with me for whatever time I have left. He said, "Dorvian, I can hear them. Not words, not commands, just patterns, like a river. I can see where it flows before it gets there. I know what the enemy will do before they do it. I know where every shot will land. I know which men will die tomorrow and which will survive. And I cannot stop knowing. I tried to ignore it. But every time I did, soldiers died. Our soldiers, men and women I am responsible for. So I listened, and they lived. Tell me that was wrong." I did not answer his question because it was not a question that had an answer. Or rather, it had an answer. But the answer was the kind of truth that does not offer comfort. He was right that listening had saved lives. He was right that ignoring the knowledge would have cost them. And he was damned regardless because the source of that knowledge was the warp. And knowledge from the warp is never free. And the price is never apparent until it has already been paid. I have seen what happens to men who accept gifts from the ruinous powers, even gifts given with apparently benign intent. The road always ends in the same place. Always. Without exception. Tzeentch does not corrupt through malice. He corrupts through understanding. He gives you a piece of truth, and then another, until you are so dependent on that truth that you cannot function without it. And by then you are his, and the truth becomes whatever he needs it to be. Torvald knew this. I could see it in his face. He knew what he had become, and he knew what had to happen next. And he sat there and waited for me to do my duty with the same quiet composure he had shown in every engagement I had ever witnessed. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not call for his guards. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his collar, and looked at me with those gray eyes that had seen patterns in the chaos of war that no human mind was meant to perceive, and I raised my bolt pistol and shot him through the heart. He fell back in his chair, and the maps on his desk were scattered by the impact, and I stood there in the silence that followed and did not move for a very long time. The regiment did not take it well. They were not supposed to. A commissar who executes a beloved commanding officer does not get thanked. He gets hated. The 77th Dracian knew Torvald as the finest officer they had ever served under, a man who had saved their lives repeatedly through what they believed was tactical genius. They did not know about the writings. They did not know about the source. They knew only that Commissar Maesk had walked into their colonel's tent and shot him. and the official explanation that Torval had been compromised by chaos influence sounded to them like exactly the fabricated justification commissars use when they want to remove an officer they disagree with. I could have shown them the evidence. I could have displayed Torval's writings and let the regiment see for themselves the slow, creeping corruption of a brilliant mind. I chose not to because the evidence was tainted, and showing chaos-touched material to 2,000 soldiers was itself a vector for corruption, and I would not risk spreading the very disease I had just cut out. So I endured their hatred. I endured the silence that fell when I entered a room. I endured the cold looks and the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. I endured 3 fragging attempts over the following month. The first 2 were clumsy, a loosened harness on a transport, a last round fired from cover that missed because the shooter's hands were shaking. The third nearly killed me. A frag grenade rolled into my quarters in the dead of night by someone who knew the rotation of the sentries, which meant an officer or a veteran sergeant, someone competent. I was awake because I am always awake, and I made it behind the ferrocrete washstand before it detonated, and I still carry the scarring across my back and left shoulder where the fragments found me. I never learned who threw it. I did not investigate because a commissar who hunts his own assassins is a commissar admitting he has lost control, and I had not lost control. I had made a choice. The right choice, the only choice, and the cost of that choice was that the men I was responsible for keeping alive had spent a month trying to kill me, and one of them had very nearly succeeded. The Solemnos campaign concluded 3 months later. The warp rift was sealed by Inquisitor Cole and his psychers in a ritual I was not permitted to observe and do not wish to speculate about. The Chaos Warband was destroyed. The Cathedral of St. Caradine's repose was declared purgatus and sealed permanently. Cole reviewed my execution of Colonel Torval personally. He read my report, which cited insubordination and dereliction of duty under fire, the standard charges, nothing that mentioned the writings or the source. Then he set the report down and told me he had read Torval's personal effects himself after the fact. He knew exactly what I had concealed, and he knew that concealing evidence of chaos taint from an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus was, by the letter of Imperial law, a heresy that carried the same sentence as the corruption itself. He could have had me executed on the spot, and the regiment with me. He did not. He looked at me for a long moment with eyes that had seen more of the warp than any man should survive, and he said that a commissar who cut out the rot before it spread, and who understood that chaos-touched evidence shown to 2,000 soldiers is itself a weapon, was more useful to the Imperium alive than dead. He signed the review and moved on. He had made the same calculation I had. A clean regiment was worth more than a technically correct purge, and I had handed him a clean regiment. The 77th Dracian lived because 2 men who should have destroyed it both decided independently that it was worth keeping. The 77th had lost 412 soldiers during the campaign, a number that would have been significantly higher without Torval's early strategic decisions, which meant that the man I killed had saved more of his soldiers through his corruption than I could have saved through my intervention. That is the kind of arithmetic that commissars learn to live with, because the alternative is not living at all. Torval saved lives with tainted knowledge. I ended the source of that knowledge before it could metastasize into something that would destroy the regiment entirely. Both things are true. Neither thing makes it right. The 77th's new commanding officer was Major Elara Shesh, the regiment's second-in-command, a sturdy, humorless woman from Dracia's northern continental plateau who had approximately the same emotional range as a fortified bunker and the tactical creativity to match. She was not Torval. She would never be Torval. Nobody would. But she was competent, she was loyal, and most importantly, she was clean. I worked with her for the next decade without incident, without warmth, and without ever developing the kind of respect I had felt for her predecessor. That was probably for the best. Respect is a liability in my profession, as I had learned the hardest possible way. The years after Solemnos' reach were different. I was different. The 77th soldiers noticed it before I did. The first execution I performed after Torval's death was a supply clerk named Jorins, caught selling regiment rations to a civilian black marketer during the Varenholt campaign. Before Solemnos, I would have given him the speech, the one about duty, about sacrifice, about the Emperor's expectations, the one that was half performance and half genuine belief. Instead, I walked up to him at morning assembly, read the charges in a flat voice, and shot him. No speech. No warning beyond the single chance I had already given by regulations. No jokes. The regiment stared. They had been used to Commissar Maesk's wit, the dry comments, the dark humor that made the killing easier to process. That Commissar was gone. In his place was something more efficient. I gave you one chance. If you wasted it, you died. Clean, professional, and fast. The soldiers stopped laughing around me. They started obeying faster. It was not an improvement in any way that mattered as a human being, but it was an improvement in every way that mattered as a commissar, and I had stopped pretending there was a difference between the two. The 77th saw action on 6 more worlds over the following decade. Minor conflicts, mostly. The Imperium's wars are not all grand crusades and apocalyptic last stands. Most of them are small, ugly, forgotten affairs. Brushfire wars on the periphery of sectors that the Administratum barely acknowledges, and the historians never record. An insurrection on the mining colony of Fosikhtara, where the workers had seized the ore processing facilities and declared themselves a free collective, which lasted exactly as long as it took the 77th to deploy and demonstrate the Imperium's position on collective bargaining. A xenos incursion of indeterminate origin on the dead world of Kellis Tertia, where something ancient and malevolent had awakened in the ruins and needed to be put back to sleep with extreme violence. A border dispute on Gurena's threshold that turned into a full-scale engagement when the local PDF declared loyalty to a renegade governor. Each campaign taught me something. Each campaign killed soldiers I was responsible for. Each campaign added names to the list of faces I kept in my memory, the ones I had executed and the ones I had watched die. By my 30th year of service, the list was long enough that I had stopped differentiating between the two categories. Dead is dead, regardless of who pulls the trigger. Then came Vreth, and I learned what real war looked like. I had fought orcs and Dark Eldar and the Servants of Chaos, and a dozen lesser threats that do not merit individual recounting. I had not fought Tyranids. Nothing in my training, nothing in the tactical primers, nothing in the veteran stories had prepared me for the reality of fighting the Great Devourer. Vreth was a verdant world, temperate and lush, one of those rare planets where the biosphere was cooperative rather than actively hostile. And it was exactly this abundance of biomass that attracted the Splinter Fleet. Hive Fleet Vorosk, a tendril of some larger fleet, whose designation I was never given clearance to know, entered the Vreth system with approximately 14 bioships and began its approach with the methodical, patient hunger that makes the Tyrannid species uniquely horrifying among all the threats the Imperium faces. The 77th was part of a garrison force on Vreth, supplemented by 3 other guard regiments and a partial company of Adeptus Astartes from the Onyx Sentinels chapter who had been in-system on a separate mission and were redeployed when the Tyrannid threat was identified. The Onyx Sentinels are relevant here because their involvement illustrates what the Tyrannid threat actually means. Space Marines are the Emperor's finest warriors. They are post-human killing machines engineered for warfare at a level that makes even the best guard soldiers look like children playing with sticks. On Vreth, I watched a squad of Onyx Sentinels engage a Tyrannid Carnifex at close range. The Carnifex was approximately 4 meters tall, weighed more than a battle tank, and had biological weapons systems that could breach ceramite armor. The Marines killed it. They killed it in 45 seconds of coordinated bolter fire and power sword strikes that were so precise and efficient that it bordered on mechanical. And then another Carnifex came, and another, and a swarm of Hormagons that numbered in the thousands, and gargoyles that blackened the sky, and something in the distance that was so large my mind initially refused to process it as a living thing. The Marines held their position, because Marines always hold their position, and they killed and killed and killed, and it was not enough, because the Tyrannids do not stop. They do not negotiate. They do not retreat. They consume, and there are always more. The defense of Vreth lasted 3 weeks. I will spare you the tactical details because they are largely irrelevant. When you fight Tyrannids, tactics matter only until the swarm reaches critical mass, and then all that matters is ammunition count and the willingness to keep firing after hope has become a memory. The 77th fought well. Colonel Sesh fought competently. The Onyx Sentinels fought magnificently. It was not enough. After 3 weeks, the Imperial forces had been pushed back to a defensive perimeter around the primary spaceport, and the evacuation order came. Not a full evacuation. There was not enough transport capacity for that. A prioritized extraction, essential military assets, senior command staff, and whatever civilians could be crammed into the remaining vessels. Everyone else was left behind. That is how the Imperium works. When a world falls, the Imperium calculates the cost of saving it versus the cost of letting it go. And if the mathematics favor abandonment, the world is abandoned, and the people on it become a footnote in a data slate that nobody will ever read. I was responsible for maintaining discipline during the evacuation. There is no duty in the commissariat more wretched than overseeing a retreat. Soldiers will charge into gunfire. They will hold positions they know are indefensible. They will die screaming defiance at enemies they cannot hope to defeat. But tell them to run, and something breaks. Not their courage, their understanding of themselves. A soldier who fights is a soldier. A soldier who retreats is just a person, and people panic. I executed 11 men and women during the evacuation of Vreth. 11. In 3 days. More than I had killed in any single campaign before. Not for cowardice, for the things that fear makes people do when the veneer of military discipline cracks. Soldiers trampling civilians to reach the transports, officers abandoning their units, supply personnel destroying rations rather than letting the Tyrannids consume them, which was logical in principle, but meant that thousands of soldiers left behind would starve before the swarm reached them, which meant their deaths would be slower and worse than they needed to be. I shot them because stopping them was more important than saving them, and because the soldiers watching needed to see that even in retreat, even in defeat, the Emperor's law held. We lost Vreth. The planet was consumed. The splinter fleet moved on toward whatever prey it would find next. The 77th Dracian extracted with 60% of its strength intact, which was considered a good result for a Tyrannid engagement. I do not know how many civilians were evacuated. The number varies depending on which report you read. I do not know how many were left behind. That number is easier to calculate. It is the difference between the planet's population before the invasion and the number of people who made it onto the transport ships. It runs into the millions, and each one of those millions was a human being with a name and a life and a face that I did not see, because I was too busy maintaining order at the spaceport to look at the people we were leaving to die. Vreth earned me my promotion to Lord Commissar. The Officio Prefectus commended my actions during the evacuation and elevated me to a rank that carried greater authority, greater responsibility, and the implicit acknowledgement that I had survived long enough and killed enough people to be trusted with the disposition of other commissars in addition to common soldiers. Lord Commissar Dorvian Maesk. It sounded impressive, it looked impressive on the official documentation. The reality was that I was 43 years old, had served in more campaigns than I could easily count, had a collection of scars that mapped out every battlefield I had visited, and had developed a tremor in my right hand that I concealed through careful management of my grip on the bolt pistol. The tremor was not age, it was damage. The recoil of a bolt pistol, fired hundreds of times over 2 decades, does things to the bones and tendons of the human hand that even the medici cannot fully repair, especially when the human in question refuses augmetic replacement. I had a sentimental attachment to the hand the Emperor gave me. It was the kind of irrationality commissars are not supposed to indulge, but I allowed myself the weakness as a small rebellion against the perfection the Schola demanded. My next posting was not a battlefield. It was a desk. The commissariat assigned me to the sector headquarters on Bacan Tertius, a fortress world that served as the administrative hub for commissariat operations across the entire Delmavon subsector. My official role was to oversee the assignment of junior commissars to newly raised regiments, review field reports from active campaign theaters, and provide strategic guidance to the Officio Prefectus on matters of regimental discipline. My unofficial role was to recuperate from 25 years of continuous combat service without admitting that I needed recuperation, because Lord Commissars do not recuperate. They endure. I endured. I sat at a desk and read reports and drank amasec in quantities that the medici would have found concerning if I had let them examine me, which I did not, and I performed my administrative duties with the same mechanical efficiency I brought to everything else. It was during this posting, buried in the archives of the Departamento Munitorum's Sector Records Office, that I found the Carhold file. I was not looking for it. I was reviewing deployment records for a routine assessment of commissariat staffing levels across the subsector's active regiments. The work required cross-referencing regimental deployment histories, which meant accessing archived campaign records going back decades. The Carhold 4 campaign file was one of hundreds I pulled for review. I opened it expecting to find the same sanitized account I had read in the official after-action reports years ago. What I found was a complete operational planning document, classified at a level that I had not previously had the clearance to access, but that my new rank as Lord Commissar now entitled me to review. The document was a pre-deployment strategic assessment authored by the Departamento Munitorum's Subsector Logistics Division, dated 6 months before the 141st Kethrian Rifles were deployed to Carhold 4. It described the Orc threat on Carhold in terms that bore no resemblance to the intelligence briefing I had received as a newly assigned cadet commissar. The briefing I had been given described a moderate orc presence requiring garrison-level response. The pre-deployment assessment described a confirmed war of significant strength with estimated numbers that dwarfed the force we actually encountered. The report projected that the full wow would reach Karhold for approximately 8 months after deployment, by which time the garrison force would be overwhelmed. The report recommended a full battle group response, minimum 4 regiments with armored support and orbital assets. The recommendation was denied. In the margins, a senior logistics officer had written a notation that I read 3 times to make certain I had understood it correctly. The notation referenced a concurrent strategic priority: the evacuation of the Threnian aristocratic houses from the neighboring Thren system, which was in the path of the same orc expansion. The Threnian nobles had political connections in the Senatorum Imperialis. Karhold IV had agricultural output and a population of bonded laborers. The mathematics were straightforward. The 141st Kethrian Rifles, a middling regiment with a politically connected but militarily incompetent commander, would be deployed to Karhold IV as a delaying force to slow the orc advance while the Threnian evacuation was completed. The garrison was expected to hold for 4 to 6 months, sufficient time for the evacuation, and was not expected to survive beyond that window. Reinforcements were not planned. Extraction was not planned. The 141st was designated, in the bloodless language of the Departamento Munitorum, as an expendable asset allocated for strategic consumption. I sat at my desk and stared at those words for a long time. Strategic consumption. 2 words that meant 3,000 soldiers sent to die so that a collection of aristocrats could relocate their wealth to a safer system. Colonel Stren had not been assigned to the 141st, despite his incompetence. He had been assigned because of it. Transferred from his family's homeworld 4 months before deployment, just as I had noted at the time without understanding why it mattered. A competent commander would have recognized the tactical situation, would have questioned the intelligence briefing, would have demanded reinforcements or extraction plans. Stren was too stupid and too politically connected to ask questions, which made him the perfect commanding officer for a regiment that was never meant to come home. I had checked out of morbid curiosity when I first arrived at Bacan Tertius. Stren had retired from active service 6 years after Karhold, with a full pension and a minor nobility title on his family's homeworld, rewarded for surviving a sacrifice he never knew he was part of. And Breck, poor methodical Breck, sitting in his quarters at 2 in the morning, staring at deployment orders that did not make sense, asking me whether someone had sent us to die on purpose. I had told him the Departamento Munitorum did not deliberately waste military assets. He had given me that look. Now I knew what it meant. He had already figured it out. And then he had been transferred to a suicide regiment and killed 4 months later, and I would never know whether that was coincidence or solution. The only reason the 141st survived at all was that the orc warg fractured before reaching full strength, splitting into smaller war bands that hit Karhold piecemeal rather than as a unified force. We had not won the Karhold campaign through skill or courage or the Emperor's grace. We had survived through luck, pure random chance, the kind of statistical noise that the Departamento Munitorum had not accounted for in their projections. My entire career was built on Karhold. My first execution, my first real combat, my first lesson in what a commissar actually does. And all of it had happened on a killing floor that someone in the Departamento Munitorum had set up deliberately, with full knowledge of the outcome, and then walked away from. I closed the file. I poured an amasec from the bottle I kept in my desk drawer. I drank it. I poured another. I thought about Breck sitting in his quarters at 2 in the morning, asking me the question I had been too young and too indoctrinated to understand. I thought about Revik Sul, the first man I ever executed, who had run from Orc Knobs on a world that the Imperium had already written off. He died so that a line would hold on a planet that nobody intended to save. His death accomplished nothing. My enforcement of discipline accomplished nothing. We were all actors in a performance that had no audience, because the only people watching were the ones who had arranged the show and already knew the ending. I filed the Carhold document back in the archive the next morning. I did not report my findings. The Departamento Munitorum official who authorized the deployment was almost certainly dead or retired by now. The Threnian aristocrats had been evacuated successfully, which meant the strategy had worked as intended. The 141st Kethrian Rifles had been disbanded years ago. There was no one to confront, no wrong to right, just a classified file in an archive that would probably never be opened again, and a Lord Commissar at a desk who now understood exactly how much his life was worth to the institution he served. The answer was in the margins of the report, written in neat bureaucratic handwriting. Expendable asset, strategic consumption. That was the price. That was always the price. I could have stayed at the desk. The commissariat would have let me. Lord Commissars who accept administrative postings tend to remain in them until death or infirmity forces their removal, and the Officio Prefectus does not object, because an experienced Lord Commissar reviewing field reports and training junior commissars is a valuable asset in its own right. I could have spent the next 20 years behind that desk, drinking Amasek and reading about other people's wars, growing old in relative comfort while younger men and women did the dying. It was tempting. I will not pretend otherwise. I was tired and hurt, and the Carhold file had stripped away the last layer of idealism I had been carrying without realizing it. The desk offered safety. It offered predictability. It offered the chance to grow old without adding more names to the list of faces I carried. I lasted 8 months. Then I requested reassignment to active field duty. The final straw was a report that crossed my desk from the 22nd Peluvian Lancers. Their commissar, a junior named Aldous Grent, the same Aldous Grent who had shared a dormitory bunk with Palav Gren in the Shola, had been killed during a routine suppression action, fragged by his own troops. The details were familiar: a patrol route, a last round from behind, no witnesses, filed as killed in action. Another commissar dead in the field while I sat behind a desk reading about it. I signed the reassignment request that afternoon. The commissariat, in its infinite wisdom, interpreted this as eagerness for a challenge. They sent me to the 4th Penal Legion, designation Erech, Redemption. I want you to understand what a penal legion is, because the reality bears almost no resemblance to the sanitized version in the recruitment propaganda. A penal legion is where the Imperium sends people it has decided are not worth killing immediately, but not worth keeping in their current form. Deserters, insubordinates, minor heretics whose crimes do not warrant execution, but do warrant punishment. Soldiers who committed offenses serious enough to strip them of their regiment, but not serious enough to earn a bolt round. And occasionally political prisoners whose connections make outright execution inconvenient, but whose continued freedom is equally inconvenient. The Departamento Munitorum calls penal legions redemptive units, meaning that their members theoretically earn forgiveness through service. In practice, they earn forgiveness through death, because penal legions are deployed to the worst theaters, given the worst equipment, and assigned the objectives that regular regiments refuse. A penal legionnaire's life expectancy is measured in weeks. Their commissar's life expectancy is only marginally better. The fourth Arachon redemption was a collection of approximately 1,800 of the most wretched, desperate, and dangerous human beings I had ever encountered, and I had once spent a week in an underhive tracking a smuggling ring. Every one of them wore an explosive collar locked around the neck, the standard discipline device of the penal legions, detonated remotely by the overseers to restore order when a legionnaire forgot his place. I held one of the detonator runes. I never used it. A commissar who relies on a collar has already admitted that his authority is not his own, and I preferred my authority to come from the bolt pistol and the certainty behind it. Their previous commissar had lasted 4 months before being killed in what the official report described as a friendly fire incident during combat operations, which was a polite way of saying his own soldiers had shot him in the back and nobody had been willing to identify who did it. I was his replacement. I arrived at the Legion's staging area on the transport world of Galden, stepped off the shuttle, and was immediately confronted by a wall of faces that radiated hostility the way a reactor radiates heat. 1,800 criminals, malcontents, and broken soldiers, most of whom had personal experience with commissars that was uniformly negative. And here was a new one, wearing a clean coat and a shiny hat, and carrying a bolt pistol that every single one of them was mentally calculating how to take from me. I stood in front of them and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then I said, "I have read your files, all of them. I know what you did. I know why you are here. I do not care. Your past is between you and the Emperor, and he has a longer memory and less patience than I do. My name is Lord Commissar Dorvian Maesk, and I am going to tell you how this works, and I am going to tell you once. If you fight when I tell you to fight, you live. If you hold when I tell you to hold, you live. If you run, I shoot you. If you threaten me, I shoot you. If you look at me in a way that I find personally offensive, I will probably not shoot you, but I will think about it, and I am a very good shot, so I recommend managing your facial expressions. Are there questions? There were not. The fourth Arachon redemption was, against all reasonable expectation, the most effective unit I ever served with. I did not expect this. Nobody expects a penal legion to be effective because the entire concept is designed for attrition, not excellence. But the thing about penal legionnaires is that they have already lost everything. Their rank, their regiment, their honor, their future. They have nothing left to lose, and a person with nothing to lose is either completely useless or completely fearless, and the difference is entirely a matter of leadership. The fourth had lacked leadership. Their officers were penal legion officers, which meant they were either fellow convicts elevated to squad leader roles, or regular guard officers who had been punished by reassignment, neither category being known for inspiring devotion. Their previous commissar had been a by-the-book martinet, who had treated them like animals and been killed like one. What they needed was not more punishment. They had plenty of punishment. What they needed was someone who treated them like soldiers who happened to be criminals, rather than criminals who happened to be soldiers. The distinction is subtle but important. I did not coddle them. I am incapable of coddling. But I applied the same principle I had used throughout my career. One chance. I gave every legionnaire one chance to demonstrate that they could function as a soldier, and when they did, I treated them accordingly. I learned their names. I acknowledged their competence when they showed it, and when they failed, I killed them without hesitation because the other side of the contract was non-negotiable. The result was something I had not experienced since my early days with the 77th under Torval. Respect, not the fearful deference I had grown accustomed to. Actual respect. The penal legionnaires respected me because I treated them as human beings, capable of redemption while simultaneously demonstrating that I would not tolerate failure. It was a narrow line. I had been walking narrow lines my entire career. The fourth deployed to 3 campaigns during my tenure. A chaos cultist purge on the cathedral world of Sanctum Perditas, where we fought through the catacombs beneath the Basilica of the Weeping Emperor and encountered things that I will not describe because some memories are better left unexamined. A greenskin cleanup operation on the orc-infested moon of Breck's Folly, which earned its name honestly because the original Imperial colonists who settled there had apparently failed to notice the extensive cave systems full of feral orcs. A navigational oversight that ranks among the most impressive displays of incompetence in Imperial colonial history, and a border suppression action on the edge of Tau-influenced space, where we were tasked with eliminating a human settlement that had voluntarily defected to the Tau Empire and needed to be made an example of. That last deployment was the one that stayed with me. The settlement was called Veskrian Hollow, a frontier town of approximately 12,000 people who had been living on the border of Tau expansion for 3 generations. They had traded with the Tau. They had adopted some Tau technology. And eventually, when the Imperium's protection proved insufficient and the Tau offered citizenship and security, they had accepted. From the Imperium's perspective, this was treason. From theirs, it was survival. The distinction did not matter to the orders I received, which were clear and specific. Destroy the settlement, execute any who resist, transport survivors to penal labor facilities for processing. I carried out the orders. A commissar carries out orders. That is the function. The penal legionnaires burned Veskrian Hollow to the ground in 6 hours. We encountered minimal resistance because 12,000 farmers and shopkeepers with Tau-supplied pulse rifles are not a military force, regardless of what the Departamento Munitorum's threat assessment claimed. I supervised the destruction and the processing of survivors, and I did not allow myself to think about what I was doing while I was doing it, because thinking is a luxury that commissars cannot afford in the moment. You think afterward. You think in the quiet hours when the job is done, and you are alone with your amasec and your memories and the faces that keep you company, whether you invite them or not. Veskrian Hollow is the reason I stopped telling jokes during combat operations. Not because I lost my sense of humor. That had been dead for years. Because the last joke I told was to a penal legionnaire who was hesitating before entering a hab block where we could hear children crying. I said something that was meant to be darkly funny about the noise they were making. And the legionnaire looked at me with an expression that I recognized because I had seen it on my own face in the mirror that morning. It was the expression of someone who has realized that the system they serve is not broken. It is working exactly as designed, and the design is monstrous. I shut my mouth and entered the hab block first and dealt with what was inside, and I have not made a joke on duty since. I served with the 4th Eracon Redemption for 3 years. They were, I think, the most honest years of my career. No pretension, no performance, no theatrical executions or inspirational speeches. Just a group of condemned men and women and their commissar doing terrible things because the Imperium required terrible things to be done, and not pretending that those things were anything other than what they were. When my rotation ended and I was reassigned, several of the senior legionnaires asked if I would stay. I could not. The commissariat does not allow that kind of attachment, but I was, for the first and only time in my career, genuinely moved by the request. These were people the Imperium had thrown away, and they had fought and died under my authority with a courage that most parade ground officers could not comprehend, and none of them would be remembered. None of them would be honored. They would die, and their names would be erased from the record, and the Imperium would raise another penal legion and fill it with another generation of disposable soldiers. And the cycle would continue until the stars themselves went dark. The final phase of my career was spent as a roving Lord Commissar, attached not to a single regiment, but to the subsector command staff, deployed to wherever the commissariat identified disciplinary issues that required senior intervention. This is the polite way of describing what amounted to being the officio prefectus's executioner at large. I went where the problems were. A regiment on the verge of mutiny because their commanding officer had been executing soldiers to maintain a fear-based discipline that had backfired. A garrison force that had gone native on a feral world and needed to be reminded of their imperial obligations. A transport fleet whose commissar had been suborned by a jeans stealer cult and needed to be replaced before the contamination spread. I moved from crisis to crisis, dispensing the Emperor's justice with the mechanical precision of a man who had long since stopped questioning the mechanism. I killed my last soldier at the age of 71. His name was Corporal Enek Trav, and he had deserted his post during a minor engagement on a world I cannot even remember the name of. Some dust-colored nothing place where nothing of consequence was happening and where Trav's absence would not have changed the outcome of the battle by a single casualty. I caught him 3 kilometers behind the lines, sitting in a drainage ditch with his las rifle across his knees, staring at nothing. He was 22 years old. He had been in the Guard for 9 months. He was not a coward. He was exhausted and frightened, and so far from home that the concept of home had become abstract, and he had simply stopped. Not run, not hidden, just stopped. He looked up at me when I approached, and he did not beg, and he did not explain, and he did not try to run. He just looked at me with those empty eyes and waited. I gave him his one chance. I told him to stand up, pick up his weapon, and return to his position. He did not move. I told him again. He shook his head, not in defiance, in something deeper than defiance, in the absolute terminal exhaustion of a man who has nothing left to give. I shot him. He fell into the ditch, and the water in the bottom turned dark, and I stood there with the bolt pistol still raised and realized that my hand was not trembling. It should have been. The tremor had been getting worse for years. But in that moment, the hand was steady, the grip was sure, and the weapon sat in my palm with the same familiar weight it had carried since the day they placed it there in the High Chapel on Greymont, and I thought of Palev Gren. I thought of him clearly for the first time in years, because Trave had the same expression Palev had worn in that stone room. Not fear, not anger, just the quiet exhaustion of someone who had reached the end of what they could endure and had made peace with what came next. Palev had been afraid of killing. Trave had simply been afraid of everything for so long that the fear had burned out and left nothing behind. I had put a bolt round through that nothing, the same way I had put one through Palev's hope. The weapon did not care. The Imperium did not care. And the only difference between the first execution and the 347th was that I no longer pretended it meant something beyond the mechanics. I holstered the pistol and walked back to the command post and filed the report and drank Amasek and did not sleep that night or the night after. He was the 347th person I had killed in the Emperor's name. He was somehow the worst. Not because he deserved it less than the others, not because he was younger or more sympathetic or more innocent. Because by the time I killed Enek Trav, I had been doing this for 53 years, and I understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful that I had become the thing the Schola made me, fully and completely. There was nothing left inside me that resembled the boy who had stood in a stone room and shot his friend and thought it was the worst thing he would ever do. 347. I keep the count because someone should. The commissariat keeps records, but records are numbers without context, entries in a ledger that do not distinguish between the man who deserved it and the boy who was simply too tired to stand. I keep the count because each one had a face, and if I forget the faces, then the executions become routine, and a commissar who finds execution routine is Fenwick Rowe with a nicer coat and a longer career. The officio prefectus retired me at 74, not voluntarily. The medici on Bacchen Tertius caught me during a routine physical that I had been avoiding for 6 years, and discovered that my body was, in her clinical assessment, comprehensively failing. The tremor in my right hand had spread. My lungs carried scar tissue from 3 decades of breathing battlefield particulates. My liver was performing at approximately 40% capacity, which she attributed to chronic amasec consumption, with a disapproval that I found endearing. And there were tumors. Multiple, inoperable, at least without the kind of augmetic intervention that would have required replacing most of my torso with mechanical components, and I had refused augmetics at every opportunity throughout my career, and was not about to start accepting them now. The Medici gave me a prognosis of 12 to 18 months. That was 7 months ago. I am currently ahead of schedule on dying, which is the first time I have been ahead of schedule on anything. The commissariat gave me quarters in the senior officers' wing of the Bacchen Tertius garrison. A small room with a cot, a desk, a window that overlooks the fortress wall, and a cabinet where I keep my amasec and my bolt pistol. They offered me a larger room, with amenities befitting a Lord Commissar of distinguished service. I declined. A small room with a cot and very few personal possessions. It took me 3 days to realize that I had recreated, down to the sparse furnishings and the solitary window, the exact room where Drill Abbot Crethon Hale had died of a heart seizure decades ago. The room I had heard described secondhand and tried not to think about. The room where an old commissar sat alone at the end of a long career, with nothing to show for it but scars and silence. I am not a superstitious man. I do not believe in fate, but I do believe in patterns, and the pattern of an old commissar dying alone in a bare room is so consistent that it might as well be doctrine. The Schola taught me that personal possessions are a vulnerability. Comfort is a weakness. The only things a commissar truly owns are his weapon, his coat, and his record. I have all 3. People come to visit sometimes. Junior commissars from the garrison who want to hear stories from the old Lord Commissar who served in more campaigns than they have years of life. I tell them stories, not the real ones. The versions that are useful, the versions that teach lessons about discipline and leadership and the proper application of summary execution. They listen with the wide eyes of young people who have not yet understood what they have signed up for, and I send them away with enough knowledge to survive their first deployment and enough ignorance to enjoy it. I do not tell them about Palif Gren. I do not tell them about Torval. I do not tell them about the Carhold Fee or Veskrin Hollow or Enoch Trav sitting in a ditch waiting to die. Those stories are mine. They belong to no one else, and they would not understand them anyway, because understanding comes from experience, and experience comes from survival, and survival is something I cannot guarantee them any more than it was guaranteed to me. Marit Eske visited once, about 2 months ago. She survived the sororitas track, served 30 years with the Order of the Sacred Rose, and retired as a Sister Superior with more scars than I have, which I found both admirable and personally offensive. We sat in my quarters and drank amasec and talked about the Schola, about Haley, about the people we had known who were dead. which was most of them. She asked me if I regretted it. Any of it, all of it. I told her no. She waited for the explanation. I did not give her one. After a while, she nodded and we drank in silence, and the silence was more honest than anything I could have said about duty or necessity or the Emperor's will. Marit left the next morning. At the door, she put her hand on my shoulder and said something in the Greymont Hive dialect that we had spoken as children, something I had not heard in decades. She said, "You were always the strong one, Dorvian." I smiled because it was the kind of thing people say when they know they will not see you again and want the last words to mean something. She was wrong, of course. I was never the strong one. I was the one who kept walking. There is a difference. So, here I am, Lord Commissar Dorvian Maesk, 7 months into a 12-month prognosis, sitting at my desk with a bottle of Amasec and a bolt pistol, and the knowledge that every word I have spoken into this recorder will be filed away in some commissariat archive, and probably never listened to by anyone. The official record will say that Lord Commissar Maesk served with distinction for 57 years, was decorated 14 times, was promoted to Lord Commissar after exemplary service during the Vreth extraction, and died of natural causes at the age of 75. That record will be accurate in the way that all Imperial records are accurate, which is to say it will contain facts arranged in an order that tells a story, and the story will bear some resemblance to the truth without ever actually touching it. The official record will not mention Palef Gren, or Brennick Torval, or Wellner Breck, or Enoch Trave, or the classified file in a Departamento Munitorum archive that proves the Imperium's greatest heroes are sometimes just its luckiest expendables. It will not mention 347 bolt rounds fired into Imperial citizens by a man who was trained to do exactly that and was never given a reason to stop. It will not mention that the man with the bolt pistol was, in the end, exactly as disposable as the people he shot. The only difference was that I wore a nicer coat, and I lasted longer, and nobody ever stood behind me with a weapon to make sure I kept walking. I kept walking on my own. That is either the bravest or the stupidest thing about me, and I have never been able to decide which, but I would do it all again. Every shot, every world, every name on the list. Because without the Commissar, the line breaks. Without the line, the regiment falls. Without the regiment, the world burns. And I have seen enough burning worlds to know that whatever the Imperium is, it is the only wall between humanity and the dark that wants to eat it. I was part of that wall, a small part, a replaceable part, but a part. The Amasec is almost gone. The window shows the first gray of dawn over the fortress wall. I can hear the garrison beginning to stir, boots on metal walkways, the distant barking of a drill sergeant, the sounds of an Imperial military installation, waking up to another day of the Emperor's work. Somewhere in this garrison, a young cadet commissar is putting on his greatcoat for the first time and looking in the mirror and trying to see the man he will become. He cannot. He will not understand what he is until the first time he kills someone, and by then, it will be too late to become anything else. The bolt pistol is on the desk in front of me, the same one they gave me in the High Chapel on Greymont. The same one I used on Palev Gren in the stone room. The same one Torval asked me about on that rooftop on Halver's Landing when he asked if it ever talked to me, if the weight of it shifted and the decision was already made before my mind caught up. It has been on my desk every day for 57 years. I have maintained it with the obsessive regularity of a man who understands that his weapon is the single most important object in his life, more important than any personal possession, any relationship, any memory. It is loaded. It has always been loaded. A commissar's weapon is always loaded because you never know when the Emperor will require its service. And right now, sitting in a bare room that looks like the room where Crethon Hale died, I think Torval was right about one thing. The weight has shifted. The decision is already made. I have one execution left to perform. Not because I am finished, because I choose to be finished. A commissar does not wait for the disease to decide. A commissar does not lie in a medici ward while his body fails by degrees, diminished, dependent, pitiful. A commissar decides. A commissar always decides. That has been my one true authority in a life spent enforcing someone else's rules. Not the power to take life, the power to choose the moment. I pick up the bolt pistol. The weight is familiar. The grip fits my hand the way it has always fit, despite the tremor, despite the damage, despite the years. I do not need to check the chamber. I checked it this morning, as I have checked it every morning for 57 years. 348. The Emperor protects.